Good morning. Thank you all for being here today. I'd like to extend my appreciation and thank you to Kathy and Arun and Anand, who actually invited me here. He's been inviting me for 3 years. This is the first year I was able to make it, and so I'm so excited to have this privilege to speak with each of you today. I was asked to talk a little bit about my own journey in my own career trajectory in the context of social entrepreneurship. And so today what I'd like to do is share kind of step by step the experiences that I've had and also some reflections on what they've meant and how this field has grown. So I've been working in this field of social entrepreneurship and impact investing for about 15 years. And so I'm excited to share with you and also learn from the rest of the panels for the day. So first, I thought it'd be nice to honor the place that we're actually in San Francisco. So I don't know how many of you are actually from San Francisco. Is anyone from San Francisco? Yeah? Has anyone ever been in an earthquake? Whoa, that's actually a lot bigger than I thought. Do you remember how it felt, the sort of loss of control and the sort of realization that it was always a false sense of control? And I don't know how many of you have had these experiences, but certainly there's many, many stories of people who really came together to support each other after such a crisis and such a tragedy. And I think that's a really beautiful essence of what we're talking about here today, why we're all convened, that so much of what we do together in our own collective interest is also in our own self-interest. So I thought I would share with you, if you haven't seen it already, on the left column here is this old San Francisco. This is Market Street, just down the way there. And I love the action and the activity, the hustle and the bustle of all the different people, the way they're dressed. You can really get a sense of what it was like to be the wealthiest and largest town at the time, the turn of the century. And then on the right side, what we have is actually the earthquake. This is what San Francisco, the same place, looked like in 1906 after the earthquake and after the fires. And so it's a completely different, devastating reality here. And so I decided to show this because, as many of you know, it is now, let's see if I can get to the next one there. Oops. There we go. As many of you know, it's 100 years later, in 1915, when San Francisco was chosen to host the World's Fair. And so what a beautiful way to think about collectively rebuilding a community that has continued to flower and flower and flower. So this is actually what it looked like in 1915. GE had 1,000 lights that they had created, and it was all spun out. There was the largest building in the world at the time that actually had an airplane fly through it for the first time ever. So some really remarkable things were rebuilt, and it wouldn't, you know, it was really the 31 countries and other states that came together for 47 miles of pathways through San Francisco to rebuild this. And as a reminder, many of you have already seen the ferry building lit up at night like this, which will happen like this for the next year or so. And some of the buildings still remain as really important features for us in San Francisco. The Palace of Fine Arts has actually been, as many of you know, was Exploratorium or a museum for education for a long time, and is now a social innovation space, actually. So the Exploratorium has moved, and a social innovation space called the Hangar is now in the Palace of Fine Arts. So if you think about the impact that just one huge earthquake had in terms of the type of growth and burgeoning of support of this community, it's pretty powerful. And so it's a nice thing to remember every time we look up at the ferry building as we're walking down the street. So as I said, I was asked to talk a little bit about my own path. And my work in social entrepreneurship started about 15 years ago, and I was lucky enough to have been one of the first employees of the Skoll Foundation just a few months after it was started. And so Jeff Skoll was one of the co-creators of eBay, and at the time, we had this chance to spend some time with folks like Bill Drayton of Ashoka, who had been working in social entrepreneurship for 30 years, several others like David Bornstein, who had written a book about how to change the world, to really delve in and say, okay, what could the Skoll Foundation do in the area of social entrepreneurship to really kind of move the needle? And so at that time, that word was not very well known. There were many social entrepreneurs for years and years and years, decades and centuries before that. But as a term and as a collective field that we could all come together with towards a certain target, it wasn't quite there yet. And so I wanted to also honor here Greg Dees, who was one of the people that influenced me and us, and he passed away last year. He's an academic, actually, so Professor Dees was the first academic to really come up with a definition in 1998 for social entrepreneurship, and was a really remarkable man. So while I was at the Skoll Foundation, we did a lot around investing, connecting, and celebrating social entrepreneurs. So some of that was done through grant making, like awards that were given to these amazing people all over the world. Some of that was done through a forum in Oxford, similar to this. At the time, now it's about 10 years old, and at the time, it was one of the first convenings to try to bring people from different parts of the world to discuss these type of approaches. And we created an online community in early days before Friendster, before the sort of early days of social networking. Social Edge was up with the context of social entrepreneurship. And one of the first social entrepreneurs that I ever learned about, actually, was Florence Nightingale. So many of you probably haven't thought of Florence Nightingale necessarily as a social entrepreneur. But in fact, she was a nurse. She was sent by Britain to Crimea in order to work in the hospitals during a wartime. And she saw that it was just such a disease-infested and lack of records, and many, many soldiers were dying. And there was no respect for any of the actual nurses who were serving the people in these hospitals. So she implemented several really important things, like hand washing, that all of us benefit from today. Very much so, I hope. And she essentially created norms, created new structures and repetition throughout the system of the healthcare system she was serving in through nurses. As a result, nurses were trained and more respected. Hospitals were cleaner and more hygienic. Fewer soldiers actually died from disease and infection. Fewer of us actually died eventually over time as this grew. And then one of the important things, no medical records were kept before. So she started to keep medical records, and even more important, she shared those with the family. So she would write letters to the family, which is another key important part of our health and well-being. So from being not respected at all to being the second most famous woman in Britain, beyond the Queen, is a pretty big influence that she's had just by trying to address a social problem. So today, we have a great, great lineup. We're going to have these wonderful lessons from the field, from Olivia, Thomas, Christopher, Brandy, and Michael. So we'll get the chance to delve into some of the models that are out there and some of the things that are happening in current day, not just as Florence Nightingale's day. My first experience actually in the field, sort of being outside of Silicon Valley after the Skoll Foundation, was working with the Acumen Fund. And this was about 10 years ago. One of the investments that the Acumen Fund made, so this was, at the time they called themselves venture philanthropists, they're more now calling a sort of catalytic patient capital or impact investing. And I was able for the year, as a fellow, to spend time with one of their investments called A to Z, which was a mosquito net manufacturing business in Tanzania. And so A to Z actually had a fairly simple solution, just like Florence Nightingale, simple solution, wash your hands. Simple solution around nets. Treating insecticide nets will prevent and significantly diminish malaria. As a global community, many, many people, many organizations and partners came together over time. And malaria, one of the greatest things in the last 10 years that have happened, and no one ever talks about it, is malaria has fallen by almost half. This is huge. This is a big deal that, so many less people. It's a preventable, curable disease, right? And there were still people dying every day of it, and unnecessarily. So folks like the Acumen Fund and the A to Z and all of the other partners that they had actually have had a huge impact on people's lives, not just in Africa, but elsewhere. So one of the other things that has been done with folks like Acumen Fund or Triodos Bank, which was another organization that I spent some time with, is raising the visibility of what's possible beyond philanthropy, but leveraging types of capital in the traditional capital markets. The World Economic Forum here actually has done a really good job of taking what many of the pioneers in impact investing have experimented with and done, and trying to build up into the mainstream what these opportunities are for more traditional investors and more traditional capital markets players. But definition actually is important. So for those of you who are interested in impact investing, what's important to note here is really approach. It's intentional. There's an intent behind both a financial return, but also the social value that's created. And most of the time, what that means is that it's measured. And most of the time, what it means is intrinsic in these business models that are being invested in is that value. So it's not necessarily a trade-off of financial versus social, that there are these great models that are intrinsic in them, create great social value. So as I said, the World Economic Forum has done a great job convening. I'm a part of a community there called the Young Global Leaders. And in this community, there are several people acting in the context of social entrepreneurship, social innovation, and impact investing. But what's also nice to see is the mainstream news is starting to pick up on some of these opportunities. We have a long way to go before this is the creation of the world we want to live in, right? I mean, we have a long way to go before every day we walk to, buy something or, we see something that it is intrinsically socially creating value. However, there are some more mainstream investors that are beginning to make public commitments to impact investing, which is really powerful, especially given this kind of short time frame that we've had to actually show financial results and the tough economic time globally along the same lines. And global leaders are starting to join the conversation, many of whom at first kind of ignored it, as some of you know in the middle there. Others that are starting to come along and help raise the visibility of new models of thinking about how to use our money in very meaningful ways. So 8 years ago, I joined a couple of other people, and we created Bamboo Finance. And I have to tell you how excited and proud I am to be here at Wharton, because 3 of the founding members of Bamboo Finance were actually from Wharton, including Jean-Philippe de Schrevel, who was the founder, sort of visionary, and had created something called Blue Orchard previous to that did work in fixed income, focused on microfinance many years before. So Bamboo Finance was created as essentially our way of experimenting with a private equity fund structure, and eventually we had 2 funds, raising money from traditional investors, so individual high net worth investors, as well as institutional investors, so Dutch pension fund, sovereign wealth fund from Abu Dhabi. We wanted to prove that if you invested in these type of ventures that were essentially supporting low-income people through healthcare, energy, water resources, their access, that you could also do quite financially well and create the world that you want to live in an equitable society. And it's still going. It's still an experiment because this kind of thing takes time. We have 4 exits, all of which are double-digit IRR. We actually have some really powerful examples of social systems that have been changed. But it's still an experiment. So $250 million is actually quite a lot for an impact investing fund. There are, especially one that started, several years ago, almost 8 years ago. There are some still large challenges in order to make this more mainstream. If you think about the global asset pool that we have the potential to leverage, it's huge. So, right now, you can see where some of these sources are coming from. It's a couple of years old, this data. But, the larger pools of capital have yet to be tapped. And part of the reason, actually, is that impact deal sourcing is actually fragmented. It's all over the world. It's diverse in its sector. It's diverse in its region. And the models are consistently, being experimented with. So what this means for a private equity investor is actually that finding deals and creating the mechanisms efficiently in order to invest in them can be really challenging and often expensive. So when I say expensive, I basically mean that if you have a team of investment professionals who are vetting a deal and due diligence and structuring a deal and investing and managing it over time, particularly probably in an area that might be a bit new, might be globally in its context, it's actually expensive. And it's just as expensive to do that for a $2 million deal that it is for a $12 million deal in a portfolio. So if you think about costs and management of portfolios, this is one of the big challenges for impact investing. So what do we need to do? Actually, we need to make sure that those early stage ventures have enough support to get up into large enough companies to absorb bigger capital if that's suitable for what their longer term goals are. This will then trigger opportunities for larger institutional investors. So pension funds and others, again, for them, it's also not ideal to have a very small deal in their portfolio and spend a lot of time managing it, just because it's possibly an interesting social impact. So we need to find a way to make these opportunities, these investment opportunities, as powerful and as large in order to yield the global asset pool opportunity that's there. Today we're going to hear from some great investment portfolio examples. And here's our speakers for later in the day. So I'm excited to get the chance to spend some more time with them and learning their approaches. And I wanted to share with you briefly, before moving on from Bamboo Finance, one example of a portfolio company. And going back to the Florence Nightingale experience of the simple things like hand washing really matter. And in this case, actually, Vita Gas is in Mozambique, and we invested a couple of $1 million in this company. They create distribution for liquefied petroleum gas, so like propane that you would use maybe here in your barbecue for St. Patrick's Day yesterday. But essentially what this is actually used for here in Mozambique is for household cooking, where people usually use charcoal and wood. It's also used in the context of Vita Gas for vaccines in the vaccine supply chain, so refrigeration systems. So Vita Gas was actually created because Mozambique was having this big crisis around vaccines were getting to the country, and yet they weren't actually getting out into the clinics that needed them, or if they were spoiling. And so a quite successful venture, Vita Gas, because actually, since they've started, they found that vaccine coverage rates increased just by gas, just by putting this mechanism of energy in there, by 38%. So it went from 60-something% to 90-something% coverage. That's remarkable. That is remarkable. So Vita Gas actually is a for-profit entity in Mozambique. It was created, though, by two nonprofit organizations. And then it was invested in, we were a shareholder and I was a board member, by a Bamboo Finance, which was a private equity fund, a commercial private equity fund. So there's some interesting structures. At Bamboo, we had a structure called a SICAF-FIS, which is essentially a private equity structure in Luxembourg. The FIS part actually in French means social impact fund. It's not very different from any other kind of private equity fund in Luxembourg. Where it's different is that it signals to investors your intent and your responsibility to serving that intent. So today we're going to hear actually about some great models out there, B Corp certifications, public benefit organizations, et cetera, that will help us understand a little bit more about some of those models and things that are being experimented with. We're also going to hear about technology in service of social impact. And so both these models and the technology context is something that's near and dear to my heart for the next era of my life. So as I've committed to share with you sort of what this trajectory of my career looked like and how the field has emerged as I've been stepping along with it, I'm now launching a business that's a public benefit corporation. We chose a legal structure that's only been around for about a year in Delaware as a public benefit corporation. The company is called Real Life, and its intent is actually to make it easier for people to care for one another. So Real Life actually was created for a couple of different reasons. The first being that I had searched long and far for the most innovative things happening in healthcare. I think it's one of the things that are going to happen that is going to transform significantly in the next year, in the next 5 to 10 years. In our lifetime, I was looking for, okay, what can I do next where I can really shape something and guide it that will be transformed close, where I could actually see it and not have to wait centuries and centuries and centuries. So what I decided is I started to scour. I did an entrepreneur in residence role with a group called Incandescent. And I was so excited by genetics and all the advancements and its influence on biotech, by telemedicine, by all the transformational things that were happening in terms of learning about diseases and being able to treat them. And then science just kept on coming back and telling me, actually, go back to the basic, simple things. If you really look at it, no matter what all of these advancements do for us, most of the time, there's some really simple things, wisdom that we've known for centuries, like if we want to be healthy, we should sleep enough, eat well, probably exercise a little, go for a walk. We should have a sense of purpose, be touched or connected to other people in a meaningful way, and have a social network around that. And so there's actually a very small number of things. These aren't really complicated things. We don't need millions of dollars to engage in those, especially if you consider yourself an unhealthy person. And so Real Life is basically about being able to bring people together to support each other in a time of a crisis. And so in my life, this is actually a friend of mine, and in my life this past year, nobody has wanted to be me, let me tell you. I've had 4 friends that passed away. I've had several friends that are dealing with cancer. One of my friends who's 42 had a stroke, and she's a mom of 3 and ran her own business. And as I was sort of seeing these things happen, my mom had a hip replacement, like all these things were happening, and I was like, how can I help? How can I help you get through this tough time? And I found myself going to their homes, doing laundry, or dropping off someone's kids, or bringing dinner, or whatever. But it's such a, again, like the earthquake feeling, you feel so out of control. You feel so out of control. How many of you have ever felt like that with loved ones around you? Just want to help, but not sure how. Life's all busy and not sure what to do. And so I kept thinking, gosh, we have all these great technologies to do all these amazing things, and why is it so hard to figure out how to care for someone? And so instead, we step back and we kind of ignore it, and we sort of pretend like we're busy, and not everybody engages because you don't know exactly what to say and how to say it. And so I want to make that easier. I think there's excess capacity to care. I think that is, sort of Uber leveraged this excess capacity of cars. I actually think we have significant excess capacity to care and to channel that wisely. And so that's basically what Real Life is about. And so we are creating essentially a mobile technology that helps you coordinate during tough times, things like all the non-medical needs you have, so that your care can continue after the hospital. And this, healthcare institutions as well are in a deep crisis and are really looking for new alternatives. And so this is one of the things that I'd like to be able to provide at least some kind of solution, if not for the field, but just for my own life. So I'm going to play you a video that we just made. And it's very simple because we have a very small budget. Oops.
Real life situations hit all of us, caring for aging parents, cancer diagnosis, or helping a friend through a tough pregnancy, or a neighbor through surgery. Loved ones want to help, but everyone is busy. They don't know how to help, or even where to start. Dealing with a sudden or chronic health condition can be overwhelming when the doctor's visit ends for the most important things in life.
So that's wheel. So I want to conclude by just sharing kind of why I'm motivated to do this. So not only from the personal experiences I shared with you, although that should be enough for anyone, but I'm motivated by the demographics. I'm getting older. We're all getting older someday. Somebody's going to need to take care of us. Actually, we're living a significantly longer. There actually is fewer people that will be there to take care of us. And the infrastructure is not there to support healthy and happy and vibrant, creative ways to connect with each other and remain healthy and happy, not just alive. So that motivates me. I'm also motivated because health crisis is the #1 reason for bankruptcy in the United States. Not something we should put up with. Not a necessity by any means. So despite good intentions, our healthcare system actually is really inefficient. It's focused on certain things that are not in its best capacities that probably a lot of friends and family and network could contribute to strengthen our healthcare system in more meaningful ways and ultimately our health. So I think it's ripe for a revolution. I'm also, having my own experience, very motivated by the fact that on average, people who are caretaking 20 hours a week taking care of their loved ones. That attributes to $25.2 billion in lost productivity alone from people who have to leave work to take care of somebody. That's huge. Imagine what we could do with that. Imagine, what would you spend that on if somebody actually showed up for work? What would they be innovating? What would they be creating? Or where else could they be spending their time? I'm also motivated by the fact that the Silicon Valley, kind of San Francisco scene, could use a healthy dose of women-led tech companies, and our team is also quite ethnically diverse. So I want to conclude by saying that we can do great things. And they often are pretty simple. They're right in front of us. They're smiling at the person next to you. They're reaching out and helping. And they're creating really simple structures to do what's already natural in our human behavior. So I'll just conclude by saying, next time you walk by the Ferry Building, and you look up at night and you see that reminder of what the world did for San Francisco, feel hopeful and feel excited, because it's really possible, even if the odds seem long, like those crazy features of San Francisco after the earthquake. It's possible. So thank you very much. Sure. Yes, yeah.
We will have about 5 minutes for Q&A. We're running a little bit behind schedule. So if there are any questions, I think you would like to
Sure.
address
Yeah,
them.
happy to answer any questions.
There are a couple of mics going around, so please.
Here in San Francisco. Yes, yeah. I previously lived all over, and I found that this is the city that I love the most. Any other questions? Or yes. Yeah, I think that I think there's a ton of opportunities. I think what you probably want to do is find the things you're most excited about or love in terms of a sector or in terms of a skill, and then find those individuals that are in that space. It's probably no different than what you would do in the more traditional business world, although there's less networking structures. I think here in San Francisco, it's actually a really good community. And there are several, sort of job opportunity contexts to switch over. But ultimately, business is business, whether you're running a nonprofit that needs, operations and good management of its finances and good management of its clientele, or whether you're running a large, private equity fund. There's a lot of transferable skills either way. So it's being able to, translate those. And so our team at Bamboo Finance, actually, we have about 30 people from all over the world. And so being able to, one thing that people from Wharton, I think, especially have is this ability to work globally and to really sort of interact with people from all over the world. And I think that's another powerful tool that you probably naturally bring as well. So there's there's several sort of, if you wanted to talk or anybody wants to talk one-on-one, there's actually several tools and resources and things that might be useful depending on which area of business you wanted to get into. And I'm happy to, which area of kind of social innovation or impact investing or whatever that looks like, to, if I can be helpful, please feel free to reach out to me. So, yes.
It's a technology, and I'm interested to know how you use your technology at real life.
I didn't quite hear. So you work with young kids with heart disease.
We have a technology platform that matches needs and resources for people working in the field of pediatric cardiac care in low-income, middle-income countries.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested to know how you use your technology for your mission.
Yeah. So our technology is the core of our business offering. So we are just starting out. So to answer your question, we're not yet. So we're just starting out and in the cycles of learning. We spent actually the last year mainly with individual people in different contexts and learning about what the needs are for someone like this. Our extension is actually naturally what you're doing. So we're going to start here in the United States first. We're going to start with mainly making tasks actionable and really easy for people to sort of delegate to the people they love and connect that to a range of different systems, whether it's your healthcare system, insurance, et cetera. And especially to a community of other people who've gone through stuff that you're going through at the same time. So things like cancer treatments, et cetera. There's a ton of knowledge, and it feels very overwhelming for people to try to find it. So whether that looks like in the future some kind of service, concierge service, or some kind of volunteer partnerships or whatever, matching those resources and being a connected place for that is our core sort of longer-term vision. As well, globally. So I've lived all over the world, and I can't imagine not being able to take this to other places. It probably might even be adapted and adopted in a more powerful way than it could in the United States. So we'll see. It sounds like we could probably be great partners. So. Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit more about a public benefit corporation?
Sure, yeah. So I think there's a panel later that may go over some of it, but basically public benefit corporations were created out of the interest of being able to allow shareholders to make decisions beyond maximizing the financial returns for a company. So in general, much of the limitations behind the growth, some of the limitations, I would say, behind the growth of things like social enterprises and impact investing in particular happened, when, for example, foundations didn't want to invest out of their endowment because they had a fiduciary responsibility to maximize the financial return. So what you end up having is a lot of people who are investing and profiting off of ventures that were, and large companies that were probably creating much of the problems, and then they were spending a small amount of this money to fix them. So many board members and shareholders felt like their hands were handcuffed. And so folks like B Corp, the certification process led to this. GEARS, which is a global impact investment rating system, led to this. And so our ability to be a little more refined in how we actually measure social and environmental impact has allowed for some of the standards that are now being held up to say we can both contribute to the financial yield of the company and the social and environmental impact, and therefore legally we can make decisions based on that. And so the reason that we chose, and it's pretty controversial actually, there were some lawyers that were like, don't be a public benefit corporation, there's all these issues, and it's new, and so we chose Delaware. It's only been there a year. And, but ultimately, to me, it's just like at Bamboo, the SICA Fizz. It signals what we care about, and why wouldn't we want to do that? And so if you see, incorporation, so it's very similar to a C Corp, has all the same, it's a commercial entity, there's no tax benefit. It is simply a marker for the type of value that that company is meant to create, and the responsibility of the board members to lead in that direction and to lead the team in that direction. So, so I'm pretty excited about it.
We have another question back here.
Sure.
I was curious if you had any problems, particularly in your international work, in dealing with different political and legal systems, and how do you deal to overcome those obstacles?
Yeah, it's a great question. Some of the biggest challenges that we had at Bamboo were actually currency related. So that's, a challenge in itself because our fund was a US delineated fund. So we're investing in companies that were yielding, their local currency activities, like the rupee or the rand, et cetera. And so that in itself was a challenge. In the political context, we haven't run into too much of that. I mean, we haven't had, most of the time we're investing in companies that are already there. We did have one company that was creating a low-income housing structure, essentially, and they ran into a lot of political challenges. So people sort of asking and trying to get them to pay for jumping over, some of the regulatory issues in order to get that developed. Some of the challenges around being able to essentially get approval when maybe that wasn't the sort of spot that, that a certain politician wanted that to be placed. Most of the time, though, we've built a pretty good network of partners globally and have been able to work some of those things out. Another challenge, though, is that our team at Bamboo was pretty small, 30 people, and so being all over the world. We did eventually create offices in Nairobi, in Bogota, in Singapore, and Luxembourg, a couple other places, but basically it's difficult to be really, really close in that context and still, do that in a cost-efficient way, essentially at the size of a $250 million portfolio. So yeah, I think more often than not, we actually had support from government. So Graça Machel, for example, in Mozambique, was one of the key people that supported Vidagas and was on the board for that for a very long time. And so the leadership in a lot of countries was pretty, and still is pretty welcoming. There are times when regulatory issues get in the way. Most of the markets that we're working in, healthcare, energy, all these things, you can think about those. Regulations are there for a reason. They're there to protect our interests. And in most cases, they're good. But in a lot of cases, when they block access for low-income people to things, they end up being, a big challenge. So being able to provide affordable services at a lower cost, we did kind of run into, in one case, for example, regulatory authorities in the healthcare space that it made it a little more difficult for that model to evolve bigger. And so we had to adapt it. The company had to adapt it. And now, actually, just to give you a sense, now that company had been acquired by a large insurance company and is being the model to serve low-income people is actually being the biggest growing piece of their business, which is really a nice signal to us that we're starting to mainstream certain things if we just stay the course and are patient enough. So, great. Thank you very much.